It was an unusually cold night for this time of year. I was alone on patrol, as so often in recent months. The streets were empty, the city lights were behind me, and only the endless country roads stretched out before me. It was the kind of night where the wind howled at the patrol car windows and the fog lay along the road like a silent companion. The radio traffic was quiet, almost too quiet for my taste. I slowed down, my senses sharpened. And a strange unease spread within me. It was as if something was in the air, something dark that I couldn't grasp. Such nights were not new to me, but this time it was different. The darkness seemed thicker, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. The cold crept through my bones, and I didn't suspect that this was just the beginning of an eerie encounter. As I continued down the rural road, my radio flickered. A report of a vehicle accident nearby. No details. Just a blurry coordinate. I accepted the report and headed in the indicated direction, but something in me resisted. It was an incident like any other, but why did I have this nagging feeling that there was more to it? The radio crackled again, this time louder and clearer. Possible accident on Old Country Road, kill 17. Please check, the dispatcher said, but the voice sounded strangely distorted, almost like an echo. It was as if someone was speaking far away and at the same time very close. A shiver ran down my spine, but I ignored it and reported my position. Kilometer 17 was directly on my route, about 10 minutes away. The road was deserted, no other vehicles in sight, and the fog grew thicker. As I got closer, my car's headlights began to flicker, something that had never happened before. I pulled over to the side of the road, checked the radio and the lights. But everything seemed fine. The radio crackled again, but this time there was nothing but silence. I felt watched, but there was no one else there. The silence around me was so oppressive that I could barely breathe. I drove on, and the closer I got to the specified location, the heavier the feeling in my chest became. Finally, I saw something in the fog, a shadow on the roadside that barely moved. My heartbeat quickened, and I stopped again. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the car. The fog almost immediately swallowed everything around me, but I could see the shadow becoming clearer. It looked like a vehicle. As I approached, I realized it was indeed a car, or at least what was left of it. The vehicle was completely destroyed, as if it had rolled over several times. The doors were dented, the windows shattered, and the trunk was. But something was wrong. There were no tracks leading to the vehicle, no skid marks. Nothing, it just stood there as if it had appeared out of nowhere. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I walked around the car and shined my flashlight inside. No bodies, no blood, but a pungent smell of burnt rubber hung in the air. A feeling of panic crept up on me. Whoever had been in this car was now gone, and I had no explanation for how it got here. I wanted to go back to the car, but then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. Yet in the silent night, it seemed to be right in my ear. I froze. The whispering was incomprehensible, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. I turned, my flashlight frantically searching the fog, but there was nothing. My heart raced, and I felt cold sweat run down my back. I called the dispatcher, but the radio was silent. It was as if someone had cut me off from the outside world. In that moment, I knew I was not alone here. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. A distorted voice, barely intelligible, crying for help. This is, repeat, help. It sounded as if it came from a great distance, yet it was eerily clear. My stomach churned, and I grabbed the radio. Control, repeat the last distress call. I demanded, but there was no answer, only the persistent crackling and whispering that cut through the silence. The voice was gone, as if it had never been there. I got into my vehicle and tried to contact the dispatcher again. But all I heard was static. It was as if someone had jammed the entire communication system. While I was still struggling with the radio, I saw a movement in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just the fog moving, but then I recognized a silhouette. It just stood there motionless in the middle of the road. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the figure, but it was gone. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt panic threatening to overwhelm me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to collect my thoughts, but deep down, I knew I had seen something that shouldn't be there, something that was watching me. After I calmed down, I decided to investigate the surroundings further. I left the patrol car again, this time with a hand on my weapon. The fog had grown even thicker, and I could barely see 10 meters ahead, but something on the ground caught my attention. Tire tracks that suddenly ended in nothing. They led from the road into the tall grass, but there was no vehicle, nothing to explain why the tracks simply stopped. It was as if the car had simply ceased to exist. The silence was now more oppressive than ever, and the feeling of being watched returned. I could barely suppress the panic, but I forced myself to continue searching the road. I followed the tire tracks, but they led nowhere. There were no signs of an accident, no broken glass, no debris. Nothing to indicate an actual event. As I continued searching, I suddenly felt the temperature around me drop even further. It was as if the air itself was freezing. I turned and saw the silhouette again, this time closer, barely 15 meters away. It just stood there, motionless in the middle of the fog. My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then, without a sound, it disappeared again. Just as I was returning to the car, a woman emerged from the fog. She seemed disoriented, wore a thin dress, and appeared to be barefoot. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes had an empty, distant look. She spoke softly, almost whispering, as if she wasn't sure if I was really there. "Did you see the man?" she asked, her voice trembling, and I could feel that she was scared. "Which man?" I asked, trying to calm her. She slowly turned, as if expecting someone behind us, but there was no one. He called me. "He told me to wait here," she mumbled, looking into the fog. I felt my heart beat faster. Whoever she was, she had seen something I didn't understand. I asked for her name, but she didn't answer. Instead, she began to walk backward into the fog. I called after her, but she didn't respond. Within seconds, she was gone, as if she had never been there. I stood alone on the road, surrounded by fog and silence. My radio crackled again, but this time only static. I stood there alone on the road, feeling my stomach clench. The woman had simply vanished without a trace. My first instinct was to run back to the patrol car, but something held me back. I decided to search the area one more time. Maybe I had overlooked something. But the tire tracks I had found before were also gone now. It was as if the fog had swallowed the entire surroundings. I searched the grass and the road with my flashlight, but there was nothing. No sign of another person. The whispering from the radio stopped, and an unnatural silence settled over the scene. My thoughts raced. Where was the body? Where was the woman? Every step I took amplified the feeling of threat. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, and I was trapped in its center. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched, but this time it wasn't just a vague feeling. I knew that something was observing me, perhaps the whole time. The cold continued to creep into my bones, and I felt my breathing becoming heavier. Whatever had happened here, it was beyond what I could understand. I decided to leave the place as quickly as possible. Back in the patrol car, I checked the radio one last time. At first, there was only the familiar static, but then it crackled again in a way that made me freeze. "This is," repeat, the same distorted voice as before. My heartbeat paused for a moment. I tried to change the frequency, but it seemed as if the device was fixed on this one distorted transmission. "Please come," the voice repeated, but the rest of the message was incomprehensible. It was the same desperate cry for help, but this time the voice was closer, louder, as if it was coming directly from my radio. Panic rose in me. I tried to answer, but it was as if my words were lost in the ether. The fog outside grew thicker, and the world around me seemed to shrink. The recurring calls tormented my mind, and I knew I had to leave this road before something worse happened. A strange thought formed in my head. What if the voice in the radio wasn't from here at all? What if it came from another time or another place? I knew I had crossed a line between what was real and what shouldn't have been. The fog pressed against the windows, and I felt trapped in a cage from which there was no escape. I was about to start the engine when I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart stopped. A figure stood outside, directly in front of the car, staring at me through the windshield. It was the same silhouette as before, but this time I could make out more details. The face was pale, almost lifeless, and the eyes, those eyes were black without a spark of life. For a moment I was paralyzed. The darkness around the figure seemed to condense, as if it was formed from the fog itself. I reached for my weapon, but my hands trembled so much that I could barely hold it. The face did not move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring directly at me, looking deep into my soul. I knew I had to act, but my body refused to obey my commands. Finally, as if time itself slowed down, the figure raised a hand and pointed towards the road. I don't know what compelled me, but I followed the finger. In the distance, barely visible through the thick fog, I could make out the faint light of another vehicle. It was the first time I felt hope. I carefully drove in the direction the figure had pointed, but the light disappeared into the fog again. My radio crackled again. This time it was the dispatcher calling me. "Where are you? Your position is no longer recognizable." My fingers trembled as I picked up the receiver and tried to explain my situation. But the words came out with difficulty, and I heard myself sounding uncertain. Back at the station, I told my colleagues about the incident, but instead of believing me, I was met with skeptical glances. They laughed as if I had fallen for a prank and ignored my seriousness. That old country road, you've probably heard too many ghost stories. But I knew that what I had seen was real. Something was wrong with that road, and I wasn't the first to notice it. In the records of the last few years, I found reports from other police officers who had similar experiences. Incomplete reports, aborted missions, and mysterious incidents that were never properly resolved. Most of these reports were dismissed as fantasy, and the officers involved kept silent about them. But the details, they were too similar, a connection that no one was willing to see. I decided to patrol the road one last time before finally giving up on the case. It was deep in the night and the fog had lifted, but the feeling of threat remained. The silence was so dense that every sound of my car felt menacing. The road I had driven so often now felt alien. It was as if it had changed, as if it had become a place where I no longer belonged. Kilometer after kilometer, the road stretched on, but it seemed as if I wasn't making any progress. My navigation system no longer worked. And the position indicator on my radio only showed static. Every road sign I passed seemed strangely familiar, as if I had seen it before. I felt like I was driving in circles, trapped in an endless loop. The further I drove, the stronger the feeling grew that I would never leave this road. I knew I had to stop before it was too late, but something drove me further, deeper into the darkness. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was the fear of not finding the truth. But one thing was certain, this road no longer led back. As I continued driving, I heard the radio crackle again. This time, however, it was not a distorted voice, but a clear distress call as if it had just been sent. "This is Unit 45, vehicle breakdown at kilometer 17, request assistance." My heart almost stopped. Unit 45, that was my own radio call from hours ago when I first reached the accident site. I checked the time. It was impossible. The distress call was identical to the one I had sent myself, but it was coming through again now. "This is Unit 45, do you copy?" I repeated hesitantly, but there was no answer. Instead, I heard the eerie whispering in the background again, which froze the blood in my veins. I couldn't believe what was happening. Had I entered some kind of time loop as I heard the radio call again? The terrible realization dawned on me. Someone or something was repeating my own words. It wasn't me calling for help, it was something else, something imitating me, making fun of my presence. Panic seized me and I pressed the gas pedal, hoping to escape this nightmarish situation, but deep down I knew there was no escape. Back at the station, I decided to re-examine the old reports. I needed answers. I had to understand what was happening on that road. The deeper I delved into the files, the more I realized that these incidents were not isolated cases. Reports of disappeared vehicles, inexplicable accidents, and distorted distress calls kept reappearing, yet for some reason these cases were never investigated further. One record kept coming up, an accident that occurred many years ago on precisely the same road. A vehicle with 2 occupants had crashed fatally, and since then, there had been reports of strange sightings, but the vehicle was never found and the bodies of the occupants remained missing. What particularly disturbed me was that the description of the vehicle perfectly matched what I had seen that night. Suddenly, everything made terrifying sense. The disappeared bodies, the recurring radio calls, everything led back to that one accident. It was as if the road itself had become part of the accident, as if it couldn't let go of the ghosts of the past. I knew I had to face the truth, no matter how frightening it was. I knew I had to return one last time. The road called to me like a tormented spirit seeking redemption. The darkness was denser than ever before, and the fog had once again settled over the landscape as if to distort reality itself. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew there was no other way. I had to revisit the accident site to finally unravel the mystery of this road. As I drove along the road, a strange feeling of déjà vu overcame me. Every tree, every stone, every curve seemed eerily familiar, but this time it was different. There were no radio calls, no distorted voices, only the silence that enveloped me. As I reached kilometer 17, I stopped. The vehicle I had seen before was there again in the exact same spot as if it had never disappeared. I got out and carefully approached the wreck. The air was icy, and I felt unseen eyes watching me. Then I saw it in the rearview mirror of the vehicle. My own face was reflected, but it was distorted, twisted in an expression of terror. Suddenly I heard the whispering again, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. "You cannot escape." In that moment I knew I would never escape this road. The shadows that had been watching me all along were not just an illusion, they were real, and they had come to take me. The whispering surrounded me, growing louder, more urgent. As if the darkness itself was reaching for me. I wanted to run away, but my legs refused to obey. It was as if the road was holding me, as if it would never let me go. The figure I had seen before appeared again, this time directly in front of me. It came closer, slowly, and its eyes were deep black, as if they held darkness itself. I felt the cold seep into my bones, and my breath grew heavy. There was no escape. I was trapped, another ghost on this cursed road. I heard the sirens of my colleagues in the distance, but they wouldn't find me. No one would ever find me. The road had taken me, just as it had taken so many others, and as the darkness enveloped me, I knew I would remain here forever, a shadow that never disappeared. It was a routine patrol like any other night. My colleague and I were on our way back to the station when the radio call came in. A patrol car, Unit 32, was reported missing. It wasn't unusual for the radio to temporarily fail in these remote areas, but the fact that the car hadn't made contact for hours worried us. We were assigned to search for it. The coordinates led us to a secluded forest area where the roads were narrow and the trees were dense. It was an area we rarely patrolled because it was sparsely populated, but tonight was different. As we drove deeper into the forest, the darkness became impenetrable and the feeling of threat grew. It was as if the trees themselves were watching us. Something was wrong, and my instinct told me this wouldn't be an ordinary search. After about 20 minutes of driving, our radio crackled. It was the radio call from Unit 32, distorted and difficult to understand. "Help, stuck, not sure," was all we could hear before the signal broke off again. We tried to establish contact, but the connection was dead. The dense forest seemed to swallow the signal. My colleague looked at me, and we both knew we had to be careful. The further we drove, the denser the fog became. Visibility was barely 5 meters, and the forest seemed to come alive. The sounds around us, the rustling of leaves, the cracking of branches, grew louder. As if the forest itself was warning us to go no further, but we couldn't turn back. We had orders to search for Unit 32, and something in me desperately wanted to find out what had happened. When we reached the spot where the patrol car had last been sighted, we found nothing. No vehicle, no tracks, as if Unit 32 had never existed. But the radio crackled again, and this time we clearly heard a voice saying, "We're here." But that was impossible. It was as if the voice was coming from the forest itself. We got out of the car and started searching the area on foot. The fog was so thick that you could barely see your hand in front of your face. I shone my flashlight on the path ahead, but all I saw were shadows moving in the fog. My colleague walked ahead, and suddenly he stopped. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing to the ground. In front of us were footprints leading directly into the forest. They were fresh, as if someone had just walked here, but the strange thing was that they stopped abruptly in the middle of the path. No sign that the person had turned back or gone on. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. My colleague and I exchanged an uneasy glance. "This doesn't make sense," he mumbled, but we both knew something very eerie was happening here. We followed the tracks deeper into the forest. The fog grew thicker, and the darkness seemed to envelop us. The sounds of the forest fell silent, and a strange stillness spread. Suddenly we heard the radio again. "We're here." The same distorted voice, but where? We couldn't see anyone, and the footprints were gone. It was as if the forest itself was mocking us. After another 10 minutes of searching, we finally discovered something. Unit 32 patrol car stood abandoned on a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. The doors were open, but the vehicle was empty. No signs of a struggle, no bloodstains, nothing. It was as if the occupants had simply disappeared. My colleague shone his flashlight inside, looking for clues, but there was nothing unusual to be found. The radio in the vehicle was dead, no signal, no connection to the station. I checked the engine. It was still warm, as if the car had only recently been abandoned, but the occupants were nowhere to be found. What the hell happened here? my colleague asked, but I had no answer. It felt as if we had fallen into a trap set by the forest itself. As we examined the vehicle, we suddenly heard footsteps behind us. We turned around, but there was no one. The fog was so thick that we could barely see more than a few meters. "There's someone there," my colleague whispered, but I wasn't so sure. It didn't feel like we were alone, but whatever was watching us didn't show itself. We decided to go deeper into the forest, hoping to find the missing unit. As we penetrated deeper into the forest, we began to hear it. At first, it was just a faint rustle, almost like the wind blowing through the leaves, but then it became clearer, voices softly whispering, barely audible, but there. "Help us," I heard, and my heartbeat quickened. I looked at my colleague, and he had heard it too. "What the hell is that?" he asked, but I couldn't give him an answer. The voices came from all directions, as if the forest itself was speaking to us. It was eerie, and the further we went, the louder they became. The words were incomprehensible, as if multiple voices were speaking at once, jumbled and yet somehow coherent. My colleague began to get nervous. "We should turn back," he said, but something held me back. It was as if the forest was luring us in, as if we were meant to find something that was not meant for us. Suddenly, my colleague stopped. "Over there," he exclaimed, pointing to something in the fog. A figure, barely visible, stood motionless among the trees. It looked directly at us, but before we could react, it vanished into the darkness. We rushed to the spot where we had seen the figure, but there was nothing, only the fog and the eerie voices that were now getting louder with every step we took deeper into the forest. The tension increased with every step we took deeper into the forest. The voices seemed to surround us, as if they wanted to guide us in a certain direction. My colleague began to get nervous, and I couldn't blame him. This forest was no ordinary place. Suddenly, without warning, we heard a loud scream. It was a scream full of panic and pain, and it pierced the silence of the night like a knife. We rushed in the direction from which the scream came, but the further we ran, the further it seemed to move away from us. It was as if the forest itself was distorting the sounds, leading us astray. "This can't be," my colleague whispered, and I could see the sweat running down his forehead, but we couldn't stop now. Something or someone needed our help. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, the voices had fallen silent. The scream was gone, and an unnatural stillness had returned. My colleague looked at me. "We have to get out of here," he said, but I knew we couldn't leave, not before we found out what had happened to Unit 32. But deep down, I had a feeling that we would soon find the answer, and that we wouldn't like it. Just as we were about to turn back and look for another way, a figure suddenly appeared in front of us. It stood motionless in the fog, barely more than a shadow among the trees. "Who's there?" my colleague called out, but there was no answer. The figure didn't move, but I felt the cold emanating from it, as if it was freezing the air around it. My heart pounded, and I instinctively reached for my weapon. "This is impossible," my colleague whispered, and I knew what he meant. The silhouette in front of us was not human, at least not anymore. It seemed to distort, as if the fog itself was forming it. But then, without warning, it turned and disappeared in the darkness of the forest. We looked at each other, both too scared to react, but something in me knew that we shouldn't follow this thing. I felt panic rising in me. This encounter was not normal, it was not natural. Whatever we had seen, it was not human. It was as if the forest was showing us its own spirits, shadows from another world. My colleague was trembling, and I could see that he felt the same way. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, but we were already too deep in the forest. Despite our instinctive fear, we realized that we couldn't simply turn back without understanding what had happened to Unit 32. But the deeper we went into the forest, the more confused the paths became. Every tree looked the same, every rock seemed familiar. It was as if the forest itself was leading us astray, a labyrinth of fog and darkness that changed before our eyes. My colleague nervously began to look at the map, but it no longer made sense. "This is impossible," he mumbled as he desperately tried to look around. The paths we had taken were gone, and all that lay before us was thick fog. It was as if the forest had deliberately isolated us, as if we had been pulled into another reality from which there was no return. I felt despair growing within me. Radio contact was still dead, and the GPS had stopped working hours ago. We were completely cut off from the outside world. My colleague suggested going back to the patrol car, but even the way there had vanished. "We're lost," he said softly, but I couldn't accept it. Something was holding us here. Something wanted us to stay. As we continued searching, we noticed something strange. Again and again, we found tracks in the mud, footprints that were so fresh it was as if someone had just walked ahead of us. but as soon as we followed them, they suddenly vanished, as if the ground had swallowed them. My colleague knelt down and examined them more closely. "These tracks, they're not human," he finally said, looking at me with wide eyes. I looked closer. The tracks initially looked normal, but on closer inspection, I noticed that they were strangely distorted. The toes seemed longer than normal, and the heel was pressed too deeply into the ground. It was as if this person or thing was much heavier than it should be. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The tracks led us deeper into the forest, and although every fiber of my body screamed for us to turn back, we kept going. Whatever it was that had left these tracks, it wanted us to follow it. "This is a trap," my colleague whispered, and I knew he was right, but it was too late. We were already too deep, and then suddenly the tracks disappeared just as abruptly as they had appeared. As we looked at each other nervously, we heard the whispering again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. "Come closer," said a voice that seemed to come from the darkness. I looked around, shining my flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing, only the fog and the endless rows of trees standing like silent witnesses. The voice repeated itself, louder this time. "Over here." My colleague stopped, his hands trembling. "That's coming from up ahead," he said, and I knew we had no choice but to follow. We continued, our flashlights ahead of us, but the further we came, the more the darkness seemed to envelop us. The voice grew louder, as if it was speaking directly in our heads. It wasn't human, that was clear. It sounded distorted, as if coming from far away, yet it was so close. When we finally reached a small clearing, the voice abruptly fell silent. We stood there, surrounded by nothing but fog and trees. My colleague looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "What the hell is this?" he asked, but I had no answer. It was as if the forest was playing with us, as if it wanted to lure us deeper and deeper until there was no escape. As we continued walking, we realized that something was wrong. Time seemed to distort, as if it was no longer linear. My watch indicated that we had been walking for hours, yet it felt as if no time had passed. My colleague also checked his watch and looked at me confused. "It's like we're in a loop," he said, and I could only agree. The forest seemed to move around us, as if we were repeatedly passing the same spots. Every tree, every stone looked the same. It was as if we were walking in circles, trapped in an endless labyrinth of fog and darkness. I tried to orient myself, but every attempt was futile. Reality as we knew it began to blur, and I felt panic rising within me. Suddenly we heard footsteps behind us. At first we thought it was just the wind, but then they grew louder, closer. "There's someone there," my colleague whispered. But when we turned around, there was no one. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling that something was following us remained. It was as if the forest was slowly swallowing us piece by piece until we were nothing more than ghosts in its darkness. As we continued to wander through the forest, we suddenly noticed faint lights in the distance. They seemed to come out of nowhere, flickering and weak, like fireflies dancing through the fog. "What is that?" my colleague asked nervously. And I couldn't give him an answer. The lights moved irregularly, as if they wanted to lure us to them. Despite the fear that flowed through me, I felt drawn to them. We followed the lights, and the closer we got to them, the stronger the feeling that we were being watched became. The lights flickered in the fog, disappeared briefly, and then reappeared in another spot. It was impossible to say what they were, but they seemed to be leading us in a specific direction, deeper into the forest, where the darkness was densest. My colleague wanted to turn back, but I had already become too curious. "We have to find out what that is," I said, but deep down I knew it was a mistake. The lights led us deeper into the heart of the forest, to a place no one should enter. And when we finally reached the edge of another clearing, we saw it, something that was not of this world. In the middle of the forest, surrounded by dense trees and fog, stood an old, dilapidated cabin. The lights that had guided us immediately disappeared when we reached it, as if they had fulfilled their purpose. The cabin looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were shattered, and the wood was weathered and black from moisture. Yet despite its dilapidated state, it felt as if someone or something lived inside. "This can't be real," my colleague whispered, but I knew it was. The cabin stood there like a dark shadow from the past, and although everything in me screamed to run away, I stepped closer. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and as I carefully opened it, the wood creaked under my hands. A cold draft hit me, and I felt my breath catch. Inside the cabin, it was dark, but I could make out shadowy outlines, old furniture, weathered by time, and something that looked like a table in the middle of the room. "What the hell is that?" my colleague asked, and I could feel the fear trembling in his voice. We entered the cabin, and with every step we took, it felt as if the darkness took a deeper hold of us. Inside, the air was stale, damp, and heavy. The darkness seemed to swallow us, and although our flashlights shone, they failed to spread light. On the table in the middle of the room was something that looked like an old radio. My colleague went closer and examined it. "That's Unit 32 radio," he said, and his voice trembled with excitement and fear at the same time. I stepped closer and saw that he was right. It was the same one we had been looking for, but it looked as old as if it had been here for decades. "This makes no sense," I whispered as I tried to comprehend the situation. We were looking for a unit that had disappeared only a few hours ago, yet this radio looked as if it had been here for ages. Suddenly, the device crackled and a distorted voice came from the speakers. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, and I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. My colleague recoiled, but before we could react, our flashlights went out simultaneously. The darkness was now complete, and the last thing I heard was the static of the radio before it fell silent. The darkness was absolute, no light, no sounds, only the silence that enveloped us like a heavy cloth. I felt my heart racing, and although I opened my eyes wide, I couldn't see. "Where are you?" my colleague called out, but his voice sounded distant, as if we had been pulled into different dimensions. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the ground, and then I heard it again, the whispering. This time it was louder, more insistent, as if the voices were speaking directly into my head. "Stay here," whispered one of the voices, and I felt the darkness close around me forever. My breath grew heavy, and I felt panic constricting my throat. It was as if the darkness was alive, as if it wanted to absorb me. In that moment, I knew we should never have come. This forest was not a normal place, and the cabin was a trap for all those who were too curious to heed the warnings. I heard the footsteps approaching, but I could no longer move. The last thing I felt was the cold breath on my skin before everything went black, and then only silence. It was shortly after midnight when the radio call came in, a strange call from a small village that officially no longer existed. Many years ago, the village had been evacuated due to a dam project, and there was no record of people still living there. The caller, whose voice was barely intelligible, claimed that something terrible had happened there and that we needed to come immediately. At first, I thought it was a bad joke. But the voice on the other end of the radio was so desperate, so filled with fear, that I couldn't help but report the incident. My colleagues at the station seemed confused. No one was supposed to be in that abandoned village. Nevertheless, I was ordered to check it out. I was skeptical, but my instinct told me to take the call seriously. As I set off, the road to the village was dark and deserted. The fog hung heavy in the air, and the only sound was the faint hum of my car's engine. The closer I got to the village, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched became. The trees rising on either side of the road seemed to stretch their branches menacingly towards me, as if they wanted to stop me. When I reached the abandoned settlement, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. The old buildings, which should have been abandoned for years, still stood there, but they didn't look as weathered as I had expected. The streets were overgrown with thick weeds, and the windows of the houses were boarded up, but there were fresh tracks in the mud. Someone had been here. I parked the car on the edge of the village and set off on foot to explore the surroundings. My flashlight cut through the darkness, and I could barely make out the dilapidated buildings. The feeling of uneasiness grew with every step I took. It was as if the village itself was protesting my presence. Everything was unnaturally silent, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Suddenly I heard something, a faint whimper, barely more than a whisper, that cut through the silence. I stopped and listened. It came from one of the houses, a small, inconspicuous building at the end of the street. The whimpering sounded like a child crying, and without thinking, I walked in that direction. But as I got closer, the sound stopped abruptly. I now stood directly in front of the house, and my heart beat faster. The house was smaller than the others, and it looked as if no one had entered it for years. The windows were boarded up with thick planks, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. I hesitated briefly before carefully pushing the door open. The interior of the house was dark and cold, and the smell of mold and decay hit me. My flashlight illuminated the narrow hallway, but there was nothing to be seen. I stepped further in, my hand on my weapon. ready for everything that might come my way. But the house was empty, no sign of life, no indication that anyone had been here recently. The crying I had heard outside was gone. I tried to calm myself, but something was wrong. The silence was so oppressive that I heard my own breath louder than ever before. I searched every room of the house, but there was nothing. Everything was abandoned, as one would expect in an old, dilapidated house. But when I entered the last room, I saw it on the wall in large, scrawled letters. A message was scratched: "They are watching you." My blood froze, and I felt a cold shiver run down my back. Whoever had left these words, they were sure they were being watched, and now it was I who couldn't shake the feeling. As I left the house, I felt the darkness closing in around me. I called for backup on the radio, but the device only emitted static. No signal, no answer. I was alone. The village suddenly seemed more alive, as if it was waking up with every breath I took. The houses that had previously seemed dead and abandoned now looked like silent witnesses watching me. As I walked through the streets, I tried to remember the reports about this village. It had been abandoned many years ago after the dam had flooded the area, but there were rumors of strange occurrences before the evacuation. People disappeared, voices were heard in the night. And the village was soon considered cursed. No one spoke about it anymore, as if the residents themselves wanted to erase the memory of it. I knew I had to dig deeper to find out the truth, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became to me that the village's past was not buried. It lived on in the shadows, in the whispering voices that were now audible all around me. It was as if the village itself was trying to warn me that I had gone too far. I stood in the middle of the deserted main street, surrounded by fog and darkness, when I heard it again. At first it was just a faint murmur, barely more than a breath that wafted through the night, but then it grew louder, clearer, voices speaking in confusion, incomprehensible yet eerily present. They came from all sides, seeming to wander through the fog, circling me. "Why are you here?" whispered one of the voices, and I felt my heart beat faster. I turned. But there was no one, only the fog that lay thick around me. "You shouldn't be here," whispered another voice, this time closer. It was as if the air itself was speaking, as if the darkness was forming its own words. I couldn't see them, but I felt their presence all around me. My hands trembled, and I tried to use the radio again. Nothing. The static was now so loud that it drowned out my own thoughts. I had to get out of here, but no matter which direction I went. The voices followed me, whispering my own name, speaking of things I couldn't understand. It was as if the past of this place had come alive and was pulling me into its grasp. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the voices fell silent. For a moment, everything was still, too still, and then I heard it: laughter. It wasn't human laughter, but something unnatural, distorted. It seemed to come from the fog itself, echoing through the streets, chilling the blood in my veins. It was as if the place was mocking me, as if it knew I was trapped. I drew my weapon and shone my flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing. The laughter grew louder, as if it was coming closer, yet I couldn't see anyone. My breathing now came in gasps, and I felt panic rising within me. Whatever was here, it was playing with me. It wanted me to be afraid, to lose control, and it was working. I started to walk faster, almost running, but the laughter pursued me. Always louder, always closer. It was as if the fog itself wanted to swallow me, to drive me insane. I screamed into the darkness, but no answer came, only the laughter that now seemed to be directly behind me. I had to get out of here immediately. While I ran through the village, I noticed that the streets had changed. Every path I knew was gone. The houses now seemed larger, more oppressive, as if they were leaning over me. The old streets had become narrow, winding paths that led to nothing. It was as if the village itself had come alive, as if it was changing its structure to keep me trapped. I tried to orient myself, but everything looked the same. The street signs I had seen before were gone, and every attempt to return to the patrol car ended in nothing. It was as if reality itself was distorted, as if the village had conspired against me. I heard the whispering again, the voices now louder and more insistent. It wanted me to stay. My flashlight began to flicker, and I felt the darkness drawing closer. The fog was now so thick that I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The streets that were once clear and distinct were now nothing more than shadows in the darkness. I no longer knew where I was, and the feeling of being lost overwhelmed me completely. As I continued to wander through the changing streets, I noticed something ominous. All around me, shadows began to move. At first, I thought it was just the lights of my flashlight flickering through the fog, but then I recognized it. The shadows moved independently of me as if they had a life of their own. They crept over the walls of the buildings, forming shapes that slowly moved towards me. "What the hell?" I mumbled as I tried to shine my flashlight on the shadows, but each time I shone the light on them, they vanished, only to reappear in another spot. My heartbeat quickened. And I knew this wasn't normal. The shadows seemed to be following me, surrounding me, as if they were part of a game I didn't understand. The cold crept up my spine, and I felt panic overwhelm me. Every step I took was mimicked by the shadows, but their movements were unnatural, distorted. It was as if the fog itself had come alive and was weaving me into a web of fear and madness. I could no longer distinguish reality from illusion. And I knew I would soon lose control. Just when I thought I was going insane, I heard it, a scream. It was the same scream that had led me here, the same one I had heard in the mysterious call. But this time it was closer, clearer. It came from one of the old buildings, a dilapidated house on the edge of the village that looked as if no one had entered it for years. I knew I had to go there, even though everything in me screamed to run away. Something led me to that house. Scream repeated, a piercing, desperate cry for help. I approached the house, and my flashlight flickered incessantly, as if it wanted to warn me not to go any further, but I ignored the warning. Something in me wanted to find out the truth, even if it cost me my sanity. The house was even more dilapidated than the others, its walls crisscrossed with cracks and the roof hanging crookedly. I carefully stepped inside and found myself in a room that stank of mold and decay. But in the middle of the room lay something, an old radio, just like the one I used in my car. It crackled softly, and then I heard it again, my own radio call repeated in an endless loop. "Please come, Unit 47, please come." I stared at the old radio, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. It was my own radio call coming out of the device in a distorted, endless loop. "Unit 47, please come," again and again. My heart pounded violently, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong with time or reality here. How could my own call be playing here in this dilapidated house that should have been empty for years? I reached for the radio, but the moment I touched it, it went silent. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost suffocating. It was as if I had crossed an invisible boundary, and I felt that I was now involved in something from which I could no longer escape. The walls of the room seemed to close in as if they wanted to engulf me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was approaching me. My pulse raced, and I quickly turned, weapon in hand, but there was no one, only the empty room and the musty smell of decay. The footsteps stopped, but the panic in me grew. I knew I wasn't alone here. Something was watching me, and it was playing with me, just as I decided to leave the house. My gaze fell on an old cabinet in the corner of the room. It was half open, and inside lay a stack of yellowed papers and photos. Although my instinct told me I should not touch them, I felt irresistibly drawn. I reached for the photos and looked at them under the flickering light of my flashlight. What I saw chilled the blood in my veins. The photos showed the village as it must have looked many years ago, but in every picture there was something eerie to be seen, people standing on the streets with pale faces and empty eyes. They didn't look alive, but like shadows of themselves trapped in time. And in one of the photos, taken in the central square of the village, I recognized something familiar, my patrol car standing in the middle of the street exactly where I had parked it. I felt my breath catch. How could this be? These photos were old, yellowed, and crumpled. Yet one of them showed my car as if it had been taken in the present. Suddenly, I noticed that in one of the pictures, a figure stood behind the car, and it looked like me. My hands began to tremble, and I dropped the photos. This was no coincidence. Something or someone was playing a cruel trick on me. I could no longer stay in the house. The air inside became heavy and icy, as if the temperature had suddenly fallen. I turned and rushed to the door, but when I reached it, I froze. An icy wind blew through the room, and it felt as if the cold penetrated directly into my bones. It wasn't the cold of the weather. It was as if the environment itself wanted to freeze me, to hold me. My breath formed small clouds in front of my face, and I heard the footsteps again, this time louder, more determined. They came closer, yet I couldn't see anything. The flashlight flickered, and I felt panic rising within me. It was as if the room around me had come alive, as if the house itself wouldn't let me go. The footsteps stopped directly behind me and I slowly turned. There was no one, only the empty room, but the cold remained and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. "You shouldn't be here," whispered a voice so soft that I almost thought it was just in my head. I had no choice. I ran out of the house, almost stumbling over the threshold, and out into the darkness of the abandoned village. But the cold followed me like a shadow that would not let go. As I stepped outside, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. The streets that were previously clearly recognizable were gone. Everything around me was enveloped in thick fog, denser than before, and all sense of direction was lost. I knew I had to return in the direction of my patrol car, but every street I took led to nothing. It was as if the village had changed its structure, deliberately misleading me. I tried to orient myself by the markings I had seen before, but nothing matched anymore. Every path, every alley seemed to pull me deeper into the fog. The feeling of disorientation grew with every step, and I felt panic spreading within me. The cold was still there. It penetrated my clothes and cut into my skin as if it were part of the fog itself. The darkness seemed to thicken, and I heard the voices again, surrounding me from all sides. "You cannot escape," whispered one voice, and another added, "You belong to us now." I started to walk faster, then to run, but the fog wouldn't let me go. I stumbled over stones and fell to the ground, but I had to keep going. My breath came in gasps, my heart raced, and deep down I knew I wouldn't leave the village that night. Just when I thought there was no way out, they appeared. The shadows I had only glimpsed before now became clearer. They formed out of the fog, figures without clear contours, yet they moved purposefully towards me. Their outlines were dark and blurred, as if they were born directly from the darkness itself. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they were watching me. I drew my weapon, but it felt pointless. Whatever these figures were, they were not of this world. They came closer, slowly, as if they were taking their time to corner me. Every step they made the air around me colder, and my breathing grew heavier. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, as if it wanted to swallow me. "Let it end," whispered one of the figures, its voice barely more than a breath. I could no longer think, could no longer see clearly. Everything around me was just fog, darkness, and the menacing proximity of the shadows. I felt my strength waning, and I knew I wouldn't last much longer. The shadows came closer and closer until I finally felt their cold breath on my skin. With the last strength I had, I jumped up and ran. I no longer knew where, but I had to get away from the shadows, away from this cursed village. My footsteps echoed in the eerie silence, and the darkness seemed to want to swallow me. The fog was so thick that I could barely see, yet I ran on, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to escape the looming darkness. The shadows followed me. I could feel their presence. They came closer, moving silently through the fog. My breath came in gasps, and my legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. Suddenly, as if by a miracle, I saw it, my patrol car. It stood directly in front of me, exactly where I had left it. I ran towards it, threw myself into the car, and turned the key. The engine started, and without a backward glance, I drove off. The headlights cut through the fog, but in my rearview mirror, I could still see the shadows following me. However, they didn't come any closer and slowly disappeared into the fog, as if they could only exist in the darkness. But the feeling of cold and fear remained, even as I left the village far behind me. I knew I would never truly escape. It was a routine assignment, or at least it seemed so. We were to transfer a prisoner to a remote maximum security institution, deep in the mountains, far from any civilization. The man we were transporting was no ordinary criminal. His file was thin, and there was little information about his past, but the brutality of his crimes was undeniable. Multiple murders, all brutal and without apparent motive. His eyes were empty when we picked him up. Not a single word left his lips. It was as if he wasn't really with us, but trapped in a world only he could see. Even during the drive, I felt a strange tension in the car. The air was thick, the silence eerie. My colleague and I exchanged nervous glances, but we didn't talk about it. We just wanted to get it over with. As we approached the remote institution, I noticed how isolated the place was, far from any city. Hidden between dark forests and steep mountains, it seemed like the perfect place to hide someone like him, someone who should never be seen again. The institution itself was old and dilapidated. Even upon our arrival, I noticed the eerie silence. No birds, no wind, nothing but the faint hum of the electrical wires surrounding the grounds. It was as if the world had forgotten this place, and perhaps that was exactly the plan. The director greeted us with a brief, emotionless nod. "You will keep him here," he said, "forever." The courtyard was empty. The few inmates we saw stared at us with dead eyes. No screams, no shouts, just an oppressive silence. The cells were small, damp, and in a miserable condition. My colleague imperceptibly shook his head as we escorted the prisoner through the narrow corridors. "What a hellhole," he mumbled. We handed the prisoner over to the guards and began to fill out the paperwork. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. It was as if the institution itself was a living organism waiting to devour us. As we made our way back, it happened. At first, it was just a faint crackle, as if someone was walking on old wooden floorboards. My colleague stopped and listened. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, for the sound repeated. It came from one of the cells further down the corridor, but according to the papers, this cell was empty. We pulled out our flashlights and shone them down the dark corridor. The sound grew louder, more rhythmic. It sounded like a soft knocking, as if someone was desperately pounding on the door. We approached cautiously, each step heavy and hesitant. "There's no one in there," my colleague whispered as we finally stood in front of the cell. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder. More impatient, I pushed the door open, but there was nothing, just an empty cell, cold and damp. But the knocking continued, this time behind us. We quickly turned around, but the corridor was empty. The lights began to flicker, as if the electricity was suddenly disturbed. The flickering was irregular, as if the building was playing with us. My colleague cursed softly, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "Let's get out of here," he said, but something held us. It was as if an invisible force compelled us to go deeper. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure at the end of the corridor, but when the light came back on, there was nothing, only the cold concrete floor and the endless doors to the cells. "Did you see that?" I asked, but my colleague shook his head. He seemed distracted, as if something else had captured his attention. We continued, and the light kept flickering. Each time it went dark. I had the feeling that something was moving in the institution, something we shouldn't see. Finally, we reached another cell, its door half open. According to the plan, this cell should also be empty, but I felt a strange attraction that made me take a look inside. My colleague stayed behind, his hands trembling slightly as he tightly gripped his flashlight. I carefully opened the door and shone into the cell. In the faint light, I could make out an old mattress and a tattered blanket. But then I saw something that made me stop. In the furthest corner of the cell, something was carved into the wall, words difficult to decipher, but clearly, "He is always here." My heart skipped a beat. Whoever had been sitting here was convinced that something or someone was in the institution. I took a step back when I suddenly felt a cold prickle on my neck. I turned around, but the corridor was empty. When we finally returned to check on the prisoner, we found his cell empty. The door was wide open, and the chains that had bound his hands lay on the floor. "What the hell?" my colleague exclaimed and rushed into the cell. There were no signs of a breakout, no struggle, no blood, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. "This is impossible," I said, but deep down I knew something was wrong. We searched the surrounding cells, but he was nowhere to be found. The other inmates behaved strangely. They just sat there, staring into space, as if they knew exactly what had happened, but they said nothing. None of them screamed or called for help. It was as if they were waiting for something. "We need to inform Central," my colleague said, but the radio only gave off static, no signal, no connection. We were alone in the institution, and the prisoner was gone. All at once we heard it, distorted voices echoing through the corridors. At first we thought it was the other inmates, but the voices sounded different, alien. They spoke in a language we couldn't understand, yet they seemed eerily familiar. My colleague stopped, his face pale with fear. "Those aren't humans," he whispered. The voices seemed to be getting closer, and although we couldn't see anyone, I felt a presence. Something was with us in the corridor, something that was following us. The darkness seemed to deepen, and my flashlight flickered again. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, but the voices wouldn't let us go. They came closer. Closer and closer, we ran through the endless corridors of the institution, pursued by the eerie voices that were driving us mad. My heart pounded and I felt panic rising within me, but no matter where we ran, the voices were always there. We came across one of the guards huddled in a corner. His eyes were wide with terror and he was muttering incomprehensible words to himself. "He's here. He's always here," he whispered as we approached him. His face was contorted with fear and it was obvious that he had lost his mind. My colleague knelt down to him and tried to calm him, but the guard just shook his head. He's coming for all of us," the guard repeated before falling silent. His eyes were empty and I knew he was trapped in his own nightmare. My colleague pulled me by the arm. "We can't help him," he said. "We have to get out of here." But deep down, I knew there was no escape. We were trapped just like the guard, and soon we would experience the same madness. We tried to reach the exit of the institution, but every corridor we took led us deeper into the building. It was as if the architecture of the institution had changed, as if it was deliberately leading us astray. The corridors were endless and the darkness grew thicker. The light of our flashlights was weak and we could barely make out the walls. "We've been going in circles," my colleague suddenly said as we passed the same door we had already passed. "That's impossible." But nothing in this institution was impossible anymore. The darkness had swallowed us and we couldn't find the exit. Every step we took brought us deeper into the heart of the institution, and the voices were always there, whispering, lurking. We stumbled into a large, empty room, in the middle of which was nothing but darkness. But as we entered the room, I immediately felt that we were not alone. The shadows on the walls began to move, slowly at first, then faster and faster, as if they were crawling towards us. My colleague took a step back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "There's something in the darkness," he whispered, and I felt it too. Something was watching us, something hiding in the shadows. We drew our weapons, although we both knew it would be useless. The shadows grew denser, and the darkness around us seemed to come alive. "We have to get out of here," I cried, but my colleague couldn't move. He stared at the shadows, unable to look away. Suddenly we heard a familiar voice. "You were looking for me, weren't you?" It was the voice of the prisoner who had disappeared. It echoed through the room, coming from all sides, yet from nowhere. My heart skipped a beat. "Where are you?" I called into the darkness, but the only answer was his laughter, deep and scornful. "I've been here the whole time," he whispered. And in that moment he emerged from the shadows. His face was distorted, his eyes glowing with an eerie light, and his smile was that of a madman. "You thought you could lock me up," he said softly, "but it was I who lured you into this trap." The darkness around us seemed to respond to his command. It contracted and enclosed us. My colleague began to scream as the darkness consumed him. I watched as it swallowed him, as his screams faded into nothingness. I tried to run to him, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were nailed to the floor. The prisoner laughed as the darkness around him surged like a living being. "You didn't understand," he whispered. "This is my world. You belong to me now." The darkness was everywhere. It seeped into my mind, making me see things that couldn't be real. Faces, contorted and pain-ridden, floated around me. Screams coming from the depths of the darkness shattered my sanity. I couldn't think anymore, couldn't see clearly. Everything around me was just madness. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes, hours, or days. The darkness pursued me, and my colleague's screams echoed in my head again and again. But no corridor led outside. Every path I took ended in a dead end or led me back to the same room. It was as if the institution itself wanted to trap me, as if it were a living being preventing my escape. "You cannot escape," the prisoner's voice whispered, always close but never visible. "This is your new home." I felt my mind slowly giving way. The darkness crept into my thoughts, making me doubt what was real and what was not. I ran, but with every step I knew there was no escape. Eventually I stopped. I couldn't go on. My body was exhausted and my spirit was broken. I dropped my weapon. It slid from my trembling hand and thumped onto the floor. The darkness was around me, but it no longer attacked me. It was there, watching me, waiting for the moment I would give up, and I knew that moment had come. The prisoner's voice echoed through the room again. "Now you understand," he said softly. "You belong to me now, forever." I sank to my knees, unable to resist. The darkness closed around me and I felt it absorb me. There was no pain, only the cold and the omnipresent emptiness in the darkness. Just before everything went out, I heard the radio on my belt suddenly come alive. "Unit 47, please respond. Unit 47. The dispatcher's voice was clear, but it was so far away, it was as if they were calling me from another world. I wanted to answer, wanted to tell them I was here, but my voice failed. The darkness had swallowed me, and with a last breath, I let everything go. The institution had taken me, just as it had taken all the others before me, and I knew I would never return.